You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. My guest today is Nida Ibrahim. Nida is a Al Jazeera TV correspondent based in the occupied West Bank. She previously reported for the BBC from several different places in the region. Our discussion today will focus on her personal journey into reporting, as well as the killing of her Al Jazeera colleague, Shireen Abu Akleh. Nida, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
And it's our great pleasure to have you. Could you perhaps, before we start talking about last year's killing of Shireen by the Israeli forces, could we perhaps go back a little and talk a little bit about yourself? So could you perhaps tell our audience what it was like, what made you want to become a reporter and cover Palestine specifically?
I've been born and raised here in Palestine, in Bethlehem specifically, and I've always been a curious child and fascinated by hearing stories and telling stories. So when the time came to study, it was without thinking that I wanted to do journalism. I had some back and forth discussions with the family who wanted an engineer, as many Arab families do. But then I tried that. I didn't do a good job at it, so I switched back to my passion. And ever since, I've been, doing the thing I love the most, which is telling stories and humanizing the Palestinian story, specifically for international audience.
Yes, indeed. I can imagine the discussions of parents. When you say, I don't want to be an engineer, I'm going to be a reporter instead, which leads me to our sort of next question, which is, you're somebody who's obviously female and Palestinian. What's it like to actually try and cover events in Palestine and news stories from that area and the region?
To tell you the truth, when it comes to having access to people's homes and people's hearts, it helps to be a female reporter because people feel that they can open up to you, especially when it comes to talking to grieving mothers or mothers who have children or sons or daughters in Israeli prisons. The kind of dynamics that goes, the communication that happens, I find that we are blessed or lucky to have that kind of engagement and access to them. They feel like they can open their hearts, they can share their experiences and their feelings with us. So on this level, I feel like we have more access. On another level, when it comes to politicians, when it comes to officials, I believe that women need to work harder to earn respect, to earn a status in the society amongst politicians. But if we've learned anything after Shireen was killed, it's how much people respected her, how many Palestinians showed up to her funeral. And that's a testament of there were reporters before us, like Shireen Abu Akleh, who opened the road for us to excel and be professional in being seen as such.
Yes, I can, but it's also, you've got to deal with Palestinian society, but it also brings you, into contact with Israeli forces and the Israelis. And so, you're a reporter, you're trying to do your job, but I imagine the occupational forces make things difficult for you to try and do that reporting.
And as we've seen with Shireen Abu Akleh's killing, we know that they don't want journalists to tell the story. And not just when Shireen was killed, we often face a lot of burdens, a lot of struggles when we try to tell the story because of the limitations of the Israeli forces. And I'm not here just talking about the fact that they push us away from places when we're trying to report, or tear gas us, or throw skunk water towards us. I'm talking also about the logistical barriers, the fact that I need a permit to get to so many places I want to report on, and that permit takes time. So many Palestinian journalists would tell you that the main obstacle is the lack of freedom of movement, lack of access to the places that they want to go to and report from, like Jerusalem, for example. But like Gaza, for example, you wouldn't find journalists here living in the West Bank who have access to the besieged Gaza Strip. They need an Israeli permit. It's not always guaranteed, and it's not always that everyone gets it. So this is a main obstacle for Palestinian journalists. But also when we try to cover protests, when we try to cover any incident involving home demolitions, arrests, raids, as we've seen with not just Shireen, with also Mu'adh Amarne, who is a reporter from Bethlehem who lost his eye a couple of years ago while he was reporting on a protest. So the challenges are huge, and we're trying so hard to be marked as press, to be, as clear as possible. But when it comes to Palestinian journalists covering the story, the Israeli forces deal with them mostly as Palestinians.
So that there is, to be clear, there is no distinction they make between the journalist and the regular civilian, is what you're saying.
That's exactly what I'm saying. You don't get any special treatment or any respect because of your job and your being there reporting on the story.
But there's been, many different Palestinian reporters throughout, the years who have been killed and injured. But there's also been many iconic ones as well. But Shireen seems to have stood out quite a lot to a lot of people. She's been a fixture on TV for, more than a generation, effectively. She's been there since the 90s. A lot of people really strongly identify with her. And, even in my own office, we have a lot of Palestinians in my own office, and it was a complete shock, that she would be killed when she was killed, because of course everyone knows obviously the reality of what's happening in Palestine in our office, and that reporters are targeted, but the targeting of Shireen hit home particularly. So with that in mind, what did Shireen come to represent to you before obviously she was murdered?
She was the role model that I used to look up to growing up, studying journalism and then working in the same office. I found it at times a privilege and honor to be working with her. And especially in the few weeks before she was killed, there was a lot of tension in Jenin, which is the place where she was shot. And we got to spend time together as one team, Al Jazeera Arabic, Al Jazeera English, working together in Jenin. So I've been lucky to have known the person and not just the journalist, and she's just as admirable, she's just as generous. One thing I remember that when we were covering in Jenin, she had a podcast, and she was invited to talk in a podcast, and she was actually asking us questions about how to keep the Palestinian story alive, and she wanted to listen to our me and my colleague Rania Zabane's viewpoint on that. And for me, for someone with her experience, with her regard and knowledge, to be like reaching out to younger journalists, asking us what we think, showed me like how humble she was. One statement that stuck with me after she was killed is a friend of mine who said, she was the voice of my childhood. And I think many Palestinians related to that. She was someone that people listened to get information about their daily lives. Because when she was on air on Al Jazeera, when the second Intifada started in the early 2000s, people didn't know when was a curfew or where it is or when it was lifted. So Al Jazeera came at a time when Palestinians didn't feel that their voices were heard, so it was important for them to feel like their story is being portrayed, but also they felt like it was their source of information as well when it comes to what's happening in town, where the Israeli forces are, where the army is. So there's this deep connection that Shireen had built with the people, which is probably explaining why we've seen people like deeply shocked. Everyone felt that part of their childhood was killed and targeted that day.
Yes, and indeed she was, for the benefit of our audience, to sort of remind people, she was killed on the 11th of May 2022. She was covering a military raid, Israeli military raid, in a camp in Jenin in the occupied West Bank, where there had been, I think, in the preceding days, a number of raids on this, and shots were fired at the scene. She wasn't, and Shireen was hit by these bullets and killed. And she was also not the only one to, I mean, there was another reporter that was injured as well. And since then, obviously Al Jazeera, as well as other media outlets, have done investigations into the shooting, as well as civil society groups. And they have shown repeatedly that the Israeli military was responsible for the shooting. But Israel continues to dispute these claims. So could you perhaps tell us, before we sort of get into the details here, could you perhaps tell us where you were when you first heard that Shireen had been killed, and what your reaction as well as your colleagues' initial reactions were?
I was at home when our colleague Rania Zabana called me crying, saying that Shireen was shot. And the first thing that occurred to me that she might have been shot in the limbs, maybe in her arm, and it's something that is, probably a rubber-coated steel bullets, because many Palestinian journalists would tell you that they were shot or tear gassed during coverage. So that was the first idea that came to my mind. And then I remember following the news from Jenin. We were at listening to the voice notes that were coming in from journalists from Jenin. And also our colleague Rania had been phoning the hospital, and they were, saying, we're trying, but it didn't look good. I remember after the Palestinian Health Ministry announced that she was killed, that I was on Al Jazeera English reporting in the next few minutes. There was no question about the fact that we needed to tell the story, and we needed to work, obviously, because the first Israeli reaction was that she might have been killed by Palestinian fighters who were in Jenin, and then the story kept changing. So for us, it was important to report what's going on, to tell the world the story. And because it was Shireen who had never fell short from reporting the Palestinian story, when she would go to any house to cover, she would make sure she would pay her respects, she would talk to people, she wants to understand and absorb their stories before she could tell them and portray them to the world. So I can't even put words to how difficult, because difficult is a trivial word for me. It doesn't reflect how that day was for us. But I remember people were crying left, right, and center. Journalists were pouring in at Al Jazeera's office to show their support, their solidarity. Everyone felt like, a member of their own family had been shot and targeted. So, but, we had to keep going. We had no other choice.
And indeed, and I imagine what made it harder wasn't just the fact that you have this, veteran reporter, as well as somebody who you knew personally, being killed. It's the fact that you have to report a story while obviously Israel continues to deny that they had anything to do with the death. Even though I'd argue, if you look at the footage, it's pretty clear, this was targeted.
There was no doubt. We know what happened. As you mentioned, several media investigations and independent companies' investigations into the matter show that she was visibly targeted, that she was shown wearing her press vest. And what are the odds of her being shot just behind the ear, in the area where the helmet and the protective gear doesn't cover? So there's no doubt that it was done by a sniper. There was no doubt between, amongst the family, Al Jazeera members, and the Palestinian people, because we've seen it happen before, that Palestinians are killed in cold blood and without accountability. And for many Palestinians, I speak to during the year, they would tell me, if someone as prominent as Shireen, as well known, she has a U.S. citizenship, she was the voice of Palestine, as many described her, and no one was able to be held accountable for her killing, then what do you expect is happening to the rest of the Palestinian people who are facing home demolitions, arrests, killing on a daily basis?
Yes, and something about Shireen's story seems to illustrate in a sort of morbid kind of way the sort of reality that many Palestinians do live with, which is that no matter who you are or what your station in life is, a moment you can still be killed because you're still seen as Palestinian.
Yeah, it's that no one is safe, which, if you would look at her report, I remember in the days after she was killed, I was sitting in the editing room with Atallah, our colleague at Al Jazeera Arabi, who also worked with her. And he was taking shots from her old reports and adding them to the scenes where her casket was attacked, where the pallbearers who were holding her casket in Jerusalem were attacked by Israeli forces there. And he was bringing all of the sounds from the previous reports and putting it, and she was as if she was narrating her own funeral. And so it's like a story that keeps happening. It's a story that we've heard so many times, and Shireen has dedicated her life to telling that Palestinian story, and indeed she paid her life while she was doing what she excelled at the most. So yes, no one is safe no matter who you are. And I think that what people say now they want, her family specifically, is not justice, because no one will be able to bring Shireen back to them, but some sort of relative justice would be holding those who killed her to account.
Yes, and that moves nicely onto my next question, because obviously we're now in 2023, and in the subsequent time since the killing in May, we've had, the US Justice Department announce an investigation into the killing. You've got, I think Al Jazeera have applied to is it ICC or ICH, the International Criminal Court, I think.
The ICC, yeah.
ICC. And obviously Shireen's own family are still pursuing this. So where is the case today? And, we'll start with where's the case today?
So the case is now at the ICC. There's been different requests, first from the Palestinian Authority, then from Al Jazeera and her family, to the Prosecutor General of the International Criminal Court to start investigating the issue. We know that a couple of years ago, the ICC's previous prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, said that she found grounds for potential war crimes in the Palestinian territory, and since then, Palestinians were referring cases to the prosecutor to investigate. So far, we haven't seen any investigation or any indictment that has been pushed. So we're waiting for that. Many Palestinians are hopeful. But when we talk to legal researchers, they're mostly telling Palestinians to be cautious, to be not too optimistic, if we put it in another way, because they say that there's the role of the ICC is complementary. So it's a long battle that Palestinians are pursuing, and many here say justice for Shireen would be justice for all of those who she reported on all of her life.
And so what is it that Al Jazeera and her family are hoping for?
As I said, Shireen is never going to be back. Nothing will bring her back to her family, who've just had their first Christmas without her, who've had to now be accustomed to a whole life without her. But a relative justice would be holding those who killed her to account, would be releasing the footage that was we know that Israeli army has cameras whenever they go and shoot in raids, and sometimes those pictures are released and sometimes they're not. So there are a lot of requests for the Israeli army to release those, but also ultimately what Palestinians and her family and her colleagues want is holding those who killed her to account.
And what do you think accountability would look like in this case? Would it be arrests and trials in Israel? Would it be an international criminal court? What would it actually look like?
It's hard for me to answer your question because what would be justice ultimately? We're not expecting it from Israel itself. It has a history of attacking journalists and silencing them and arresting them. So it's hard for me to imagine how that would be, but I know for a fact that her colleagues and her family and Al Jazeera won't stop calling for justice for Shireen.
Yes, and indeed. So moving on a little bit, could you perhaps tell us then, since, obviously Shireen's killing, you still had to go to work, your colleagues still had to report from Palestine. So what was it like trying to report from like events that are happening in Palestine in the aftermath of her killing? What was the impact on you guys? How did it change did it impact the way you report or how you do your reporting?
It's hard to answer for all of my colleagues because we have several discussions between us and amongst us, and some are scared for their lives. They want to be able to go home safely to their kids and their families. Others, they want to push further. They want to push through and continue telling the story. Even I myself, I found myself in between those two feelings of fear, but also wanting to tell the story. So it depends on what day, I guess. I don't think we've had the time and the luxury to reflect on what's happened because it was a delayed grief, right? We couldn't grieve her like a colleague, like a friend, a mentor at the time of her killing, but we had to continue working throughout the aftermath. So we're still each in their own way are trying to come to terms with losing her and with us being at the front lines, at the risk, just like other Palestinians. But also we know that journalists are also targeted because they are telling the world what's happening. So it's hard to tell you how it affected us. I think it's something that we'll have to keep experiencing. Losing someone that her killers didn't get accountable for it. I'm sure it adds to our fear. We all want to go home safely to our families at the end of the day. But we also know that it's our duty to keep telling the story.
So for the time being, you feel the duty to tell the story is driving you to keep going at this stage?
Absolutely. It's the fact that they're trying to silence journalists only serves as a motivation for us to keep going and keep telling the world what's happening here in Palestine.
And on that point, so one of the, obviously with Palestine, we get, moments of relative calm, which is where you get fewer incidences, but particularly since last year, we've noticed a huge uptick in attacks in the West Bank by Israeli forces, as well as escalating situations elsewhere. Could you perhaps tell us now what's happening on the ground right now? I mean, we keep hearing of more raids and killings. What's going on?
So 2022 was the deadliest year when it comes to Palestinian casualties and Palestinians who were killed by Israeli forces. According to the UN, since it started counting fatalities since 2005, it's been a year filled with tension and overshadowed by loss. We've been to so many funerals for so many grieving mothers who would tell you that their kids were just going to school or coming back from one, or just being shot at for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So there's a lot of feeling of sadness, a lot of feeling of disappointment, of loss, and Palestinians feeling that they were left alone. Also, we've seen last year a growing phenomena of armed men. We've seen that groups of men gather in Jenin or in Nablus or in other places in the occupied West Bank, but mainly in those two locations. And they say, you know what? The world has left us alone. We've been under occupation all of our lives, and nothing has ever changed. In fact, the reality has been getting worse and worse. And for these people, we've met some of them in Jenin, and they say, you know, we have nothing to lose. It's not like we have a life that is worth pursuing. When it comes to freedom, we're not free. When it comes to the economic situation is really bad. When it comes to, you know, dreaming of a better future, they don't have that luxury. So, and many of them believe it's their duty to fight the Israeli occupation to become free. So this is a part of what we've been seeing over the past year, and we've seen a lot of Israeli efforts to crack down on those fighters in Nablus and in Jenin, and often we see them, you know, fighting back. But overall, it's been a tough year. It's been a difficult year, and we are expecting the tension to still continue in this year because as we've seen, there has been probably the most right-wing government in Israel that took power just a few days ago, and we've seen a minister of that government, Itamar Ben Gvir, storm Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, and you know, this is something that's very sensitive to the feelings of Palestinians, Muslims, and Arabs. So we are afraid that we're going to be seeing more of the same this year.
That's interesting, because that was kind of my next question a little bit, because obviously you now have a new right-wing government, as you mentioned, but a lot of these, you know, attacks in the West Bank were accelerating under a so-called more moderate Israeli government. So to what extent does it actually matter that there's been a change in government in Israel from a Palestinian perspective?
It doesn't really matter a lot when we go to talk to people who live close to illegal Israeli settlements, which are now mushrooming, and they are expanding at a big rate. So people there tell us it doesn't matter really who's in charge, because the policies of the Israeli government in general are to keep making living for Palestinians harder. So we see growing illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. We see also the growth of outposts, which are hundreds of outposts, which is a settler or two decide to bring a caravan here and there, and they just camp out for a week or two, and then they start building and building, and then they expand, they get infrastructure, they get electricity, water, and services from the Israeli government, even though they're not even recognized by the Israeli government itself. Of course, all settlement is considered illegal under international law. But just to give you an idea that this is the reality that people are living, just, you know, outside their windows, new people came in to a piece of land, they settled in it, and then they start attacking Palestinian homes. It's, you know, something that we've been seeing a lot lately in the north of the occupied West Bank, that people have covered all of their windows with barbed wires, with like to protect themselves, because ever since the settlers have attacked the Dawabshe family a couple of years ago and burned the house, leading to the killing of the mother, father, and their young son, their baby, people felt scared that settlers would keep doing that. We've seen settler attacks being on the rise. We don't see also accountability when it comes to those attacks, nearly zero indictments when it comes to settler attacks. So for Palestinians, it doesn't really matter who's sitting at the seat of the government, who's running the affairs of the Israeli government, so long as their policies when it comes to Palestinians are more of the same.
So my last few questions, so just three more, if that's okay. You mentioned the rise in these armed factions among, you know, the Palestinians in places like Jenin and so on. From your sort of, you know, either experience of what you've heard, how do these guys, in terms of their motivation, belief, or just general outlook, compare to previous armed resistance fighters? So, you know, obviously in the mid-2000s, you had the second intifada where you had a certain crop. Is there a similarity between them? Is there a difference?
The difference is that they're mostly individuals who are across factions. They're not necessarily from one party or another, like we've seen in the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, where we've seen Fatah as a party has an armed group. Islamic Jihad has one, Hamas, and so on and so forth. What we've seen here is that Palestinians who are fed up of factions and the PLO parties, and they say, you know what, we're going to take matters into our own hands. So this is kind of the main difference that we've been noticing in the sense of their beliefs, their visions, their motivations. So for them, they feel that they've been left out by these parties, that they're left alone, there's no future, there's no hope. They would often accuse politicians of, trying to get a seat at the table at the PLO's executive committee, but not really responding to the needs of the people on the ground. So they are, in their minds, they believe that they're taking matters into their own hands. Now, in Jenin, for example, we've seen also some sort of a harmony amongst those who belong to Fatah and those who belong to Islamic Jihad, and they are working together somehow. So it's not like they're taking commands from the party, but they're kind of like working in harmony as members of the Jenin refugee camp together. The similarities, I would say, are that those who are in the 2000s and those who are now have lived all of their lives under an Israeli military occupation, that it still implements the same policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians when it comes to checkpoints, when it comes to land appropriations, when it comes to settlements, when it comes to arrests. So for them, the occupation is still there, and they would say that they have the duty and the right to fight it in any way they deem possible.
Okay, moving on now. So because you've obviously covered Palestine for different outlets, including Al Jazeera, but also BBC and others, do you feel as somebody who does a lot of reporting, and especially with international media, do you feel there's a change or a difference in the way international media deals with Palestine now?
Well, I would say that ever since more Palestinian activists have started using social media, that the Palestinian voice had kind of forced itself into the agenda of international media somehow. Yet, when we read a lot of international media's editorials, we feel like the context is not always there. The understanding of the story is not always there. For us at Al Jazeera, it's a story that I cover every day, me and my colleagues. So it's hard to miss out on the nuances. It's hard to miss out on the context of the whole story. So I think being there, being here on the ground, covering the stories, talking to people on a daily basis, definitely affects the coverage when we talk about that versus when we talk about those who come in for a week or two to try and cover the story. I'm not disregarding anyone's efforts. On the contrary, there are great journalists out there who come in and do a great job. It's just that this is a story that has so many layers, so many levels, so many details and nuances that it would need more for people to be able to report on it. But again, I'm hopeful because I'm seeing a change when it comes to how international media is covering Palestine.
So the last question I'm going to ask you then is this. So usually I would ask, somebody who's in media or journalism, if there's somebody comes to you who's not in media, say a young person thinking about a career, what you would advise. For you, let's say a young Palestinian woman comes to you saying, I wish to get into reporting and so on. What advice would you give them?
If they're not here, they should come and spend time talking to the people. I found this as the most important part of the job. Talking to people, understanding the nuances, because sometimes people are used to saying the rhetoric or what they've been listening to, or they automatically, when they're grieving, they go back to some statements about the love of homeland, and then that's all true. But sometimes I want to go with them to the depth. I want to go with them to what motivated their son. What did he or she like to do when they were younger? What did they wish to become when they grew older? One of the questions I asked someone who was holding a weapon in Jenin, like, what do you do for fun? And he's like, what does that mean? And that question like struck me. Like he doesn't have any idea of going to the beach because he's not allowed, because he'll need an Israeli permit, which he will almost never get. So it's like going, talking to the people, understanding them, going deeper with them to be able to tell the story. Obviously, read as many books as you can get, and speak to politicians, listen to, I like to see other people's reports on the story to learn more and more.
Nida, it was a great pleasure talking to you, and to our audience, thank you for tuning into Memo Conversations. Please tune in next time for more Memo Conversations.
Thank you.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.